The shortest verse in the Bible is 2 words long. You have probably heard it quoted. You may have memorized it without trying. Sunday school teachers use it as a party trick. Ask a child to name the shortest verse and watch their face light up when they get it right. But here is what nobody tells you about those 2 words. They are not a footnote, they are not filler. They are not a transitional sentence the gospel writer tossed in to move the story along. Those 2 words, Jesus wept, are the hinge on which an entire theology of God turns. And if you have ever stood at a graveside and wondered whether the God of the universe had any idea what you were feeling, those 2 words are the answer. Stay with me. Before we get to the tomb, before we get to the tears, I want you to picture a road. It is late autumn in Judea, probably the year 29 AD. The road runs northeast from Jerusalem through dry limestone hills, scrub brush, dust, the occasional fig tree twisted by years of Levantan wind. The distance is about 2 miles. In that culture, 2 miles is nothing, you walk it. Jesus is somewhere on that road when the message reaches him. The message comes from 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, who live in a village called Bethany. Their brother's name is Lazarus, and the message is urgent. John records it in chapter 11, verse 3, "The one you love is sick." That word love is worth stopping on. The Greek text uses the word phileo, not agape, the broad cosmic love God has for the world. Phileo, friend love, the love you have for someone whose laugh you know, someone whose table you have sat at, someone you have argued with and forgiven and argued with again, someone who is, in the truest and oldest sense of the word, your person. Lazarus is that to Jesus, not a disciple, not a follower from a distance, a friend. And the message from his sisters is, your friend is dying. Here is what most people miss about what happens next. Jesus does not go. He waits 2 days, he stays exactly where he is, the disciples are confused, the sisters are waiting, and Lazarus, somewhere in a small house in Bethany, is getting worse. John tells us why Jesus waited. He says in verse 4 that this sickness will not end in death, it is for God's glory. That sounds to our ears almost clinical, almost cold. But hold that thought. When Jesus finally says it is time to go, when he turns toward Bethany, his disciples panic. Because the last time Jesus was near Jerusalem, the religious leaders tried to stone him. Going back is not a small thing. Thomas, bless him, says what all of them are thinking, let us also go that we may die with him. Thomas is not being dramatic. He genuinely believes this trip may kill all of them. And Jesus walks the road anyway. By the time Jesus arrives in Bethany, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. 4 days, in Jewish tradition, this was significant. There was a belief recorded in the Talmud in a text called Semahat that the soul lingered near the body for 3 days after death, hoping to return. By day 4, that hope was finished. The body had begun to decay. Even in the coolness of a limestone tomb, the smell would have been present. 4 days means no ambiguity. 4 days means this is not a coma, this is not a deep sleep, this is not a medical mystery. 4 days means dead. Martha hears Jesus is coming and she runs out to meet him on the road. She is the practical sister, the one who was cooking while Mary sat at Jesus' feet, the one who once asked Jesus to tell her sister to help with the dishes. And even now, even here, Martha is still trying to make sense of things. She says to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." There is grief in that sentence, but there is also something else. There is an edge. If you had been here, you were not, you waited. You knew and you waited, and now he is gone. Jesus does not defend himself. He does not explain the 2-day delay. He says, your brother will rise again. Martha, still trying to find solid ground, says, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. It is a theologically correct answer. It is also the answer of a woman trying to hold herself together by reciting what she was taught, because what she was taught is all she has left. Jesus looks at her and says something no one in the history of the world had ever said before. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. He does not say he will cause the resurrection. He does not say he has power over resurrection. He says, I am the resurrection. Present tense, first person, not a doctrine, a person. Martha believes him. She goes to get her sister. And now we come to the moments. Mary comes to Jesus. She falls at his feet. This is where we always find Mary, at his feet, which tells you something about who she is. And she says the same thing her sister said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. The same words, the same grief. But something about Mary's tears, something about seeing her broken like this, surrounded by a crowd of mourners also weeping, does something to Jesus. The text says in verse 33 that when Jesus saw her weeping, and saw the crowd weeping with her, He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. That phrase in the original Greek is embrimaomai, and it is one of the most debated words in the entire New Testament. Most translators render it as deeply moved, but that is soft. The word actually carries the sense of something closer to a groan or a roar, the way an animal sounds when it is in pain. Some scholars say it carries an undertone of anger, not anger at Mary, not anger at the crowd, perhaps anger at death itself, perhaps anger at the weight of a broken world. And then John writes verse 35. Jesus wept. In the Greek, the word is dakruo. It means to shed tears quietly, not the loud wailing of the crowd around him, not theatrical grief, something quieter, something personal. The God of the universe, standing at the edge of a tomb on a dusty afternoon, cried. The crowd sees it and says, "See how he loved him." Pay attention to this. They do not say, "See how powerful he is." They do not say, "See how holy he is." They say, "See how he loved him." The proof of his love in that moment is not a miracle, it is tears. There is a question that the church has wrestled with since the 1st century, a question Augustine wrote about, a question that Cyril of Alexandria spent pages on, and the question is simply this: why did Jesus weep? He knew Lazarus was about to be raised. He had told his disciples before they left that Lazarus was only sleeping. He knew, in a way no one else in that crowd knew, that in approximately 5 minutes the man in that tomb would walk out of it alive. So why weep? Some theologians say he wept out of empathy. He entered into the grief of those around him even knowing it would soon be turned to joy. Some say he wept because he understood that raising Lazarus was, in a sense, a cruelty, calling a man back from peace into a world that would still one day have to kill him again. Some say he wept at the sight of what sin and death do to human beings, the raw evidence of a world that was never supposed to be this way. All of these may be true, but here is what strikes me most. Jesus did not dry his tears before the miracle. He did not compose himself, wipe his face, and then perform the resurrection as if the moment of grief had been a temporary weakness. He moved from the tears directly to the tomb. He stood in front of the sealed stone with wet eyes and said, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus came out. The tears and the power were not in conflict. They were both the same thing, both expressions of the same love in the same moment from the same God. Before we leave Bethany, I want you to notice one more thing. After the miracle, after Lazarus walks out of the tomb, still wrapped in burial cloth, blinking in the afternoon light, the crowd splits. Some of them believe. Some of them go straight to the Pharisees and report what happened. John tells us this in chapter 11, verse 46. And that report, that account of a dead man walking out of a tomb in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses, triggers the meeting that will lead directly to the arrest of Jesus. The chief priests and the Pharisees call an emergency session of the Sanhedrin, and a man named Caiaphas, the high priest, says something that will echo through centuries of Christian theology. It is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. John says Caiaphas did not say this on his own. He said it as a prophecy without understanding what he was saying. The miracle that proved Jesus wept for the ones he loved became the trigger for his death. Hold that thought. There is a verse in the New Testament that most people have read and moved past without stopping. It is not in the Gospels. It is in a letter, the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 5, verse 7. And it reads like this: During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Read that again slowly. Fervent cries and tears. The Greek word used here for fervent cries is krauge, and it is not a quiet word. Krauge is not the dakruo of Bethany, the silent tears at a friend's tomb. Krauge is the sound a person makes when they are beyond composed grief. It is a cry, a shout, the kind of sound that comes from somewhere deeper than the throat. This is not a picture of a serene, untouchable God serenely accepting his fate. This is a picture of a man on his knees in a garden, crying out loud enough that his disciples, who were supposed to be keeping watch, could hear him. Now here is what most people miss about Gethsemane. We read the garden scene in the Gospels and we focus rightly on Jesus' prayer, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will but yours be done." We focus on the submission. We focus on the surrender. We use that prayer as a model for our own, which it is. But Hebrews wants you to see something the Gospel accounts give you in fragments. The author of Hebrews, writing to Jewish believers who are being persecuted, who are considering abandoning their faith to escape suffering, the author says, look at what Jesus did in his worst moment. Look at what it actually sounded like. It sounded like krauge, like loud crying. And then the author says something extraordinary. He says Jesus was heard because of his reverent submission. Not in spite of his tears, not despite the loud crying, because of his reverent submission, which apparently included the loud crying. The tears were not a failure of faith. The krauge was not a moment of weakness to be ashamed of. It was part of the prayer. The grief was part of the submission. God heard the cryings. There is a name in the ancient world for what Jesus was doing in Gethsemane. The Hebrew word is happiest. It is one of the richest words in the entire Old Testament, and it is almost untranslatable in a single English word. Most Bibles render it as loving kindness or steadfast love or mercy, but happiest is more specific than any of those. Happiest is covenant love, the love that does not leave when things get hard, the love that stays at the bedside, the love that shows up at the tomb, the love that kneels in a garden and cries out loud and then says, "Nevertheless, your will." Hosea uses the word when God says, "I desire happiest, not sacrifice." The prophet Micah uses it. What does the Lord require of you but to act justly and to love happiest and to walk humbly with your God? And in Gethsemane, without the word being spoken, you see it in action. Jesus does not pray from a distance. He does not submit from behind a wall of divine composure. He comes close, close enough to weep, close enough for krauge, close enough to feel the full weight of what is coming, and then he submits from inside that weight. That is happiest. That is the love that does not protect itself from pain in order to keep loving. There is a theological word for what we are describing, and it is one of the most debated concepts in Christian history. The word is impassibility, the idea that God, being perfect and unchanging, cannot suffer or be emotionally affected by the events of the created world. The early church fathers argued about this constantly. Origen believed God's love necessarily involved a kind of divine passion, a willingness to be moved. Tertullian pushed back. Augustine tried to hold the tension. The debate runs through the entire history of Christian thought like a fault line. But here is what strikes me when I read John 11 and Hebrews 5 side by side. Whatever God is in his eternal nature, whatever the philosophers say about divine impassibility, the God who walked into human flesh in the person of Jesus Christ did not hold himself at an emotional distance from human suffering. He stood at the edge of a tomb and cried quietly. He knelt in a garden and cried loudly. He entered grief the way you enter a cold river all the way in without keeping one foot on the bank. And the writer of Hebrews says he was heard. Which means this: your tears are not beneath God's attention. Your krauge, the prayers you have prayed that were more crying than words, more groaning than sentences, those are not the prayers God politely tolerates while waiting for you to compose yourself. Those may be the ones he leans closest to hear. Here is the part nobody tells you about the tears of Jesus. They are not spread evenly across his ministry. The two gospel accounts of Jesus weeping, the tomb of Lazarus and the moment we are about to come to, both happen in the same narrow window of time. Both happen in the final week before his death. Both happen within a few miles of Jerusalem. Both happen in full view of people who will either follow him to the cross or betray him to the people who put him there. He does not weep at the beginning of his ministry, when he is healing crowds in Galilee and the whole region is talking about him. He does not weep when he walks on water or feeds 5,000 people on a hillside. He weeps at the end, when the city is in front of him, when the cross is close enough to smell. There is one moment, one specific afternoon on a hillside, where something happened that theologians have argued about for 2,000 years. We will get there, but not yet. To understand why Jesus wept over Jerusalem, you need to understand what Jerusalem meant. Not what it means to us, not the city we see in photographs, the golden dome of the rock, the worn stones of the Western Wall, the tourist maps, and the pilgrimage routes. Forget all of that. I want you to understand what Jerusalem meant to a Jewish man in the 1st century, who had grown up hearing its name spoken the way you speak the name of someone you love and fear in equal measure. Jerusalem was not just a city, it was the axis of the world. It was the place where Abraham had raised a knife over his son on Mount Moriah and God had stopped his hand. It was the place where Solomon had built a house for the presence of God so magnificent that when the priests carried the ark inside and the glory of the Lord filled the temple, they could not stand up. They fell to the ground. The building was too full of God to contain any human being standing upright. It was the place the prophets had wept over. Isaiah, Jeremiah, who wept so much over Jerusalem that an entire book of the Bible is named after his grief. Lamentations, the book of weeping. Jerusalem was where God lived, where God had chosen to put his name, where every year at Passover, Jewish men from across the known world, from Egypt, from Babylon, from Rome itself, would make the journey back on foot, singing the songs of ascent as they climbed toward the city. I lift up my eyes to the hills, where does my help come from? That city, that place, that is what is in front of Jesus on the road from Bethany to Jerusalem. The day is what we now call Palm Sunday. Jesus has spent the night in Bethany, probably in the house of Lazarus, the man he raised from the dead, and now he is making the journey into the city. His disciples are with him. A crowd has gathered, some of them carrying palm branches, some of them spreading their cloaks on the road in front of him. They are shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the King of Israel." The word Hosanna is itself worth pausing on. It comes from the Hebrew Hashiana, save us, we pray. It started as a cry of desperation and became, over centuries, a shout of praise. By the 1st century, it was what you shouted when a king arrived. It was a coronation word. And the crowd is shouting it at Jesus. Some of the Pharisees, watching from the edge of the road, are appalled. They tell Jesus to silence his disciples, and Jesus says something that should make the hair on your arms stand up. He says, "If they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." The stones will cry out. He is saying this moment is so overdetermined by heaven that if the human voices go quiet, the creation itself will take up the song. The rocks underneath your feet know what day this is. Now watch what happens next. Luke is the only gospel writer who records what happens next on that road. Matthew records the triumphal entry. Mark records it. John records it. All 4 gospels agree on the palm branches and the hosannas and the crowd. But only Luke, the physician, the careful observer, the man who interviewed eyewitnesses and wrote down what they saw, only Luke tells you what happened when Jesus crested the hill and the city came into view. Luke chapter 19, verse 41. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. The Greek word here is not dakruo, not the quiet tears at the tomb of Lazarus. The word is klaio. Klaio is loud weeping. It is the same word used for the crowd of mourners at Bethany. It is the word used for Peter after he denies Jesus, when Peter goes outside and weeps bitterly. It is not polite grief. It is not a single tear tracked down a composed face. It is the sound of a broken heart. Here is what that scene looks like if you let yourself stand inside it. The crowd is still shouting, the palm branches are still waving, the disciples are still caught up in the energy of the moment. Finally, they think it is happening, the kingdom is arriving, the king is riding into his city. And the king is weeping. Not tears of joy, not tears of relief that the moment has finally come. The word klaio does not leave room for that interpretation. He is weeping the way you weep at a funeral. The crowd does not seem to notice, or if they notice, they do not understand. They keep shouting Hosanna. They keep waving the branches. The celebration continues around a man whose face is wet with grief on the happiest day of his public ministry. You have to ask yourself, what does Jesus see when he looks at Jerusalem that the crowd cannot see? Luke tells us because Jesus weeping speaks. He says, and these are among the most heartbreaking words in the entire New Testament, if you had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. He is not speaking in metaphor. He is not describing a spiritual condition in poetic language. He is describing, with the precision of a military historian, exactly what is going to happen to this city in 40 years. In the year 70 AD, the Roman general Titus, son of the Emperor Vespasian, surrounded Jerusalem with 4 legions of soldiers. Josephus, the Jewish historian who was present and survived, describes what followed in his work The Jewish War with a specificity that is almost unbearable to read. The Romans built a siege wall around the entire city. No one in, no one out. Josephus records that over 1 million people died from starvation, from disease, from the violence of the siege itself. The temple, the second temple, the one Herod had spent decades beautifying until it was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world, was burned. And when the burning was over, the Romans went through the ruins stone by stone, pulling them apart to recover the gold that had melted into the cracks. They will not leave one stone on another. Jesus said it weeping on a hillside in approximately 30 AD. Josephus recorded the fulfillment of it 40 years later as a man who watched it happen. The early church father Eusebius, writing in his ecclesiastical history in the 3rd century, connects these 2 moments explicitly. He says the Christians in Jerusalem, remembering the words of Jesus, fled the city before the siege began to a town called Pella across the Jordan, and were spared. The tears on that hillside were not just grief. They were prophecy. But here is what I cannot get past when I read this passage. Jesus does not weep because he does not know what is coming. He weeps because he does. He weeps because he is riding into a city that is waving palm branches at him today and will be calling for his crucifixion by Friday. He weeps because he can see the gap between what this city could have been and what it is going to choose. He weeps because the peace that would have saved them, the peace he is literally riding toward them to offer on a donkey in deliberate fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy about a humble king, that peace is going to be rejected. He weeps because love that is refused still hurts. The theologian N.T. Wright once wrote that the tears of Jesus over Jerusalem are the tears of God over a world that keeps choosing its own destruction over the life being offered to it. That is not a small statement. That is a statement about the character of the God who made you. He is not distant from your choices. He is not indifferent to your turning away. He does not watch from behind glass, unmoved, as you walk toward the things that will break you. He weeps. There is a question underneath all of this that I want to bring to the surface. Because if you have been tracking these moments, the quiet tears at Lazarus's tomb, the loud crying in Gethsemane, the klaio on the hillside above Jerusalem, you may be feeling the weight of a question you have not quite put into words yet. The question is this: what does it mean that God cried? Not what does it mean emotionally, not what does it mean for your devotional life or your prayer journal. What does it mean at the level of reality, at the level of what is actually true about the nature of the universe? That the being who spoke the cosmos into existence stood at a tomb and shed tears, and knelt in a garden and cried out loud, and sat on a hillside above a doomed city and wept like a man at a funeral. What kind of God does that? The answer begins, I think, in the very first chapter of Genesis. Not with the creation of the world, but with a single sentence tucked into the end of the sixth day. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. That word good in the Hebrew is tav, and when it appears here at the completion of creation, it is not a grade on a report card, it is not God checking a box. It is the word you use when something is exactly what it was meant to be, when it is whole, when it is right, when it is the way it should be. Creation in its original state was tav, complete, unbroken, the way God intended. And then something happened. And it has not been tav since. Here is what I want you to understand about every tear Jesus ever shed. Every tear is an act of remembrance. When Jesus stood at the tomb of Lazarus and wept, he was not surprised by death. He was not encountering grief as a new phenomenon. He was the one who in the beginning had breathed life into dust and made it a living soul. He knew better than anyone standing in that crowd what life was supposed to be. He knew what Lazarus was supposed to be. He knew what Mary's face was supposed to look like, not broken, not wet with tears, not collapsed at his feet in the kind of grief that has no bottom. He knew what tav looked like. And death is not tav. That is what the tears are. They are the tears of a creator looking at a broken creation and feeling not from a distance, not theoretically, but standing in it, breathing the air of it, smelling the decay of a 4-day-old tomb, feeling the full distance between what is and what was meant to be. This is not weakness. This is not God having a bad day. This is love with a memory. And this is where it gets remarkable. Because the tears of Jesus are not just a window into his humanity, they are a window into his identity. In John chapter 14, the night before his crucifixion, Jesus says to his disciple Philip, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." Not anyone who has seen me has seen a representative of the Father. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Which means that every tear Jesus shed is a tear God shed. The quiet dakruo at the tomb of Lazarus, that is what God looks like when he stands at the edge of your grief. The loud krauge in the Garden of Gethsemane, that is what God sounds like when the weight of a broken world is pressing down. The klaio on the hillside above Jerusalem, that is what God looks like when he watches someone he loves choose the path that leads away from him. Not distant, not composed, not waiting for you to pull yourself together so he can engage with the tidier version of your pain. Present, weeping close. I want to speak directly to someone for a moment. You may be in a season where prayer feels like talking to a ceiling, where the silence of God is not peaceful, it is oppressive, where you have prayed the prayer and nothing happened, and you have prayed it again and nothing happened, and you have prayed it a third time and the answer is still the same unbearable silence. And somewhere in the back of your mind, maybe you have never said it out loud, maybe you are saying it out loud right now, is a version of what Martha said on a dusty road outside Bethany. Lord, if you had been here. If you had been here, this marriage would not have ended. If you had been here, my child would not have gotten sick. If you had been here, I would not be standing in this place, in this grief, holding these pieces of a life I did not choose. If you had been here. I am not going to give you a tidy answer to that prayer. I am not going to tell you that God was testing you, or that something better is coming, or that everything happens for a reason, because those sentences, however true they may be in some abstract sense, are not what you need when you are Mary of Bethany, on the ground, at someone's feet with nothing left. What I want to give you instead is this. When Mary fell at the feet of Jesus and said, "If you had been here," Jesus did not correct her theology. He did not explain the 2-day delay. He did not defend himself. He asked where they had laid him. And he wept. Before the miracle there were tears. Before the answer there was presence. Before the stone rolled away, God stood in the grief with her and let it be grief. He did not fix it from a distance. He came close. There is a pattern in all 3 moments of Jesus weeping that I do not think is accidental. At Bethany, he weeps with those who are weeping. In Gethsemane, he weeps as one who is himself in agony. On the hillside above Jerusalem, he weeps for those who do not even know they need to weep. Do you see what that covers? This is not a God who only shows up for one kind of suffering. He weeps in solidarity, standing with you in your grief, entering it, not managing it from a safe distance. He weeps in his own agony, which means he is not a God who asks you to suffer in ways he himself has never suffered. And he weeps prophetically, for the pain you cannot yet see coming, for the consequences of choices that have not yet fully landed, for the gap between where you are headed and where you were made to go. He weeps before you know you need him to. This is not a God who tolerates your tears while waiting for you to be strong. This is not a God who requires you to compose yourself before he will engage with you. This is not a God who has ever, in the history of the world, looked at genuine human grief and said, "Pull yourself together." He is the God who wept 3 times in 3 different registers, for 3 different kinds of broken. And every single time, he was the most powerful person in the room. The tears of Jesus do not contradict his power. They express it. Because only someone who loves completely, only someone for whom your life and your loss and your choices and your city actually matter, only that person weeps. The person who does not care does not cry. Indifference is always dry-eyed. The theologian Jurgen Moltmann, in his landmark work The Crucified God, argued that the suffering of Christ is not an interruption of God's nature. It is a revelation of it. That what we see in Gethsemane and on the road to Jerusalem and at the tomb of Lazarus is not God temporarily stepping outside of who he is in order to relate to us. It is God showing us with the most intimate possible clarity who he has always been. A God who loves enough to weep. A God who comes close enough to be moved. A God whose tears, every single one of them, are the overflow of a love that refuses to stay behind a wall. Now I want to go back to that hillside. Not to the theology, not to the Greek words or the historical sources or the philosophical frameworks. I want to go back to the actual moment, the dirt under his feet, the sound of the crowd, the city in the distance, because I think we have moved past it too quickly. The road from Bethany to Jerusalem crests at the Mount of Olives. If you have ever been to Jerusalem, and if you have not, put it on the list, because there is no substitute for standing in the places where these things happened, you know that the view from the Mount of Olives is one of the most arresting sights on earth. The city spreads out below you and across a shallow valley, and in the 1st century, what dominated that view was the temple. Herod the Great had spent decades rebuilding it. Josephus describes the temple complex in the Jewish War as covered in gold and white marble, so bright in the morning sun that to look directly at it was like looking at the sun itself. Pilgrims who made the ascent to Jerusalem for Passover would crest that same hill, see that gold catching the morning light, and weep at the sight of it. It was that beautiful. It was the most beautiful building most of them had ever seen or would ever see. And it was not merely beautiful, it was the place where heaven and earth touched. The place where, once a year, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies and stand in the presence of God on behalf of the entire nation. That is what Jesus sees when he crests the hill. That is what makes him weep. But here is the part that has stayed with me since the first time I read it slowly enough to feel it. The crowd around Jesus is celebrating. They are waving branches and spreading cloaks and shouting coronation words. They are, in their own way, doing exactly what they should be doing, welcoming their king. And their king is weeping over the city they are celebrating. He is the only one on that road who knows what is coming. He is the only one who can see both what Jerusalem is in that moment, glorious, golden, full of pilgrims and prayers and the smell of temple incense, and what Jerusalem is going to be in 40 years. He holds both of those realities at the same time. He sees the gold and he sees the ashes. He hears the hosannas and he hears, underneath them already, the silence that follows a city that has been burned to the ground. And he weeps. There is one more layer to this moment that most sermons do not reach. Luke in verse 42 records Jesus saying, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace." That phrase, "on this day," is doing more work than it appears. The Greek is nt hemera, taught in this day, on this specific day. And in the context of what Jesus is saying, this day is not just Palm Sunday. It is not just the day of the triumphal entry. In Luke's Gospel, this day carries the weight of the entire kairos, the appointed time, the moment of visitation. Jesus is saying the window is open. Right now in this moment on this road, with these branches and these voices and this king riding toward you on a donkey, this is the day. This is the appointed hour. This is the moment that everything in your history has been building toward. And it is passing. The kairos is passing and the city does not know it. Now here is what I need you to understand about why this is the most devastating of the three moments of weeping. At Lazarus's tomb, Jesus wept and then raised the dead. The grief was real, but it gave way to resurrection. The tears were followed by a miracle that reversed the very thing that caused them. In Gethsemane, Jesus wept and then submitted. The loud crying was followed by the cup being taken, not removed, but accepted. The krauge gave way to the cross, and the cross gave way to Easter morning. But on the hillside above Jerusalem, Jesus weeps and does not act. He does not stop the city. He does not override their choice. He does not call down the 12 legions of angels he told Peter were available to him. He weeps, and then he rides in anyway. He weeps over the city that is going to kill him, and then he rides into it. This is the moment, this is the specific afternoon on a hillside that I told you at the beginning we would get to. The moment theologians have argued about for 2,000 years. Not the miracle, not the resurrection, this. A king weeping over a city that is going to execute him and riding toward it anyway. There is a word in theology for what Jesus is doing in that moment. The word is kenosis. It comes from Philippians chapter 2, where Paul writes that Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself. The Greek is ekenosin, he poured himself out. He became nothing. He took the form of a servant. Kenosis is usually discussed in terms of Jesus giving up divine privilege to become human. And that is true. But I think kenosis is also visible in this moment on the Mount of Olives in a way we rarely talk about. Because what Jesus is pouring out on that hillside is not just glory. He is pouring out the option of self-protection. He could have turned around. He had every reason to. He knew what the city was going to do to him. He knew Judas was going to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. He knew Peter was going to deny knowing him 3 times before the rooster crowed. He knew the crowd shouting Hosanna on Sunday would be shouting crucify him on Friday. He knew all of it. And he wept and rode in anyway. The tears were not a sign that he almost turned back. The tears were the sign of a love so complete that it went forward with full knowledge of the cost. Augustine of Hippo, writing in his Confessions in the 4th century, describes God as our heart is restless until it rests in thee. He is talking about the human longing for God. But the hillside above Jerusalem shows us the reverse of that sentence. It shows us a God whose heart is restless over us. A God who cannot look at a city walking toward its own destruction and remain unmoved. A God who cannot look at a people he made, people whose names he knew before the foundation of the world, people he had led out of Egypt and fed in the desert and spoken to through burning bushes and prophets and psalms, and simply let them go without grief. The tears on that hillside are not a moment of divine vulnerability to be explained away. They are a declaration. They are God saying in the most embodied and undeniable way possible, "You matter to me. Your city matters to me. Your choices matter to me. What happens to you not in the abstract, not as a theological category, but you specifically with your specific name and your specific life and your specific way of walking away from the things that would bring you peace, that matters to me. Enough to weep over. Enough to ride in anyway." There is a hymn, one of the oldest in the Christian tradition, that captures this moment better than most sermons do. It is called The Reproaches. It dates to at least the 9th century, and it is sung in many Christian traditions on Good Friday. In it, God speaks directly to his people, and the refrain, repeated over and over, is a question. "My people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me." It is the voice of a God who is not angry in the cold, judicial sense. It is the voice of a God who is, and there is no other word for it, heartbroken. The same voice that wept on the hillside, the same voice that cried in the garden, the same voice that shed quiet tears at a tomb in Bethany. "My people, what have I done to you? Answer me." So we have walked through 3 moments. A tomb outside Bethany on a cool autumn afternoon. A garden on the eastern edge of Jerusalem in the hours before midnight. A hillside above a golden city on the most celebrated day of a life that was about to end. 3 moments, 3 kinds of tears, 3 registers of the same love. And I want to close by telling you what I think these 3 moments, taken together, are trying to say to you. Not to the crowd at Bethany, not to the disciples in the garden, not to the city that did not recognize the day of its visitation. To you watching this right now in whatever season you are in. The first thing the tears of Jesus tell you is this. God is not managing your grief from a distance. This is the thing that Lazarus's tomb settles if you let it settle. Jesus did not stand at the edge of that situation and administrate it. He did not send a representative. He did not dispatch an angel with a message of comfort. He came in a body on a road 2 miles on foot, and he stood in the grief, and he let the grief be grief, and he cried. The God of the universe has stood at a graveside and wept. Which means when you stand at a graveside, when you sit in the parking lot of a hospital and cannot make yourself go back inside, when you open a door to an empty room that used to have someone in it, when you hold a piece of paper that changes everything and you cannot breathe, you are not standing somewhere God has never been. You are standing somewhere He stood first. And He wept there. Before you arrived, He was already weeping. If this is resonating with you, if you are in a season of grief right now and what you need is not a theological framework but a person to talk to, I want to encourage you to find someone. A pastor, a counselor, a trusted friend who will sit with you the way Jesus sat with Mary. You do not have to carry this alone. And if this channel has been a place where you have found something real, consider subscribing, not because the numbers matter, but because it means more of these conversations will find the people who need them. The second thing the tears of Jesus tell you is this. Your prayers in the dark are not beneath Him. Hebrews 5 says He was heard. The loud crying, the krauge, the prayers that were more groaning than grammar, He was heard, which means the standard for a prayer that God listens to is not composure. It is not theological precision. It is not the right words in the right order delivered with the right amount of faith. The standard apparently is reverent submission, which can sound like loud crying. Some of the most heard prayers in the history of the world have been prayed by people who had no words left, by people face down on a garden floor, by people who had run out of everything except the raw, unpolished, desperate desire for God to be present in an unbearable moment. If that is where you are, if your prayers right now sound more like krauge than like the Lord's Prayer, then Hebrews 5 is written for you. He hears it. He was heard in it Himself. And if you want to go deeper into what it means to pray in the dark, the whole theology of lament that runs through the Psalms and the prophets and straight into Gethsemane, there is a video on this channel that goes into that in detail. It is linked in the description. I think it will help. The third thing, and this is the one I want to leave you with, because it is the one I think we most need to hear, the third thing the tears of Jesus tell you is this. Being loved by God does not mean being protected from the consequences of a broken world. Jerusalem was loved. Deeply, fiercely, covenantly loved, the kind of love that stretches back to Abraham, that runs through every prophet, that culminates in God Himself riding into the city on a donkey in fulfillment of a prophecy written 500 years before. And Jerusalem was going to burn. The tears on the hillside do not prevent the destruction. They do not reverse the choice. They do not reach into the future and rearrange the consequences of what the city is going to do. They just make clear with absolute clarity, with wet eyes and a broken voice on the most public day of His ministry, that the destruction is not happening because God stopped caring. It is happening in spite of the fact that He never did. This is the hardest thing about the tears of Jesus over Jerusalem, and I am not going to soften it for you. Sometimes God weeps and does not intervene. Sometimes the thing you are praying will not happen. Not because He does not love you, not because your faith is insufficient, not because you said the wrong words or skipped too many quiet times, but because we live in a world where love does not override freedom, and freedom has consequences, and the consequences of a broken world fall on people who do not deserve them. And in those moments, in the moments when the stone does not roll away, when the garden prayer is not answered the way you asked, when the city burns despite everything, the tears of Jesus are not an explanation. They are a presence. He is not explaining the suffering from a distance. He is in it with you, weeping, with the same eyes that saw the gap between what is and what was meant to be, the same heart that could not look at Mary's grief without being broken by it, the same voice that cried loud enough in a garden that the author of Hebrews could still hear it echoing 60 years later. He is not absent from the things that break you. He is the most broken by them. John 11 verse 35. 2 words. The shortest verse in the Bible. I told you at the beginning that those 2 words are not a footnote, that they are not filler, that they are not a transitional sentence the gospel writer tossed in to move the story along. I hope by now you feel wise. Those 2 words are the answer to every prayer that has ever begun with Lord, if you had been here. He was here. He is here. And he wept. Not because he had run out of power, not because he did not know what to do, not because the situation had overwhelmed him and he had no response but tears. He wept because he loved completely, because love that is complete feels everything completely, because the God who made you from dust and breathed life into you and counted the hairs on your head and knew you before you were formed, that God cannot look at your grief, your loss, your broken city, your empty tomb, your garden floor and remain dry-eyed. He is the God who wept. He is also the God who said, "Come out." And Lazarus came out. I want to close with something the theologian Karl Barth said near the end of his life, when a student asked him to summarize the whole of Christian theology in a single sentence. Barth thought for a moment, and then he said, "Jesus loves me, this I know." Not a systematic theology, not a doctrine of divine impassibility, not a 5-point framework or a carefully structured apologetic. Jesus loves me, this I know. And the proof, the embodied, historical, undeniable, tear-stained proof, is 3 moments on 3 different days in 1st century Judea, where the God who made everything stood inside the broken part of what he made and wept. Because he loves you. That is the whole story. That has always been the whole story.